This video contains graphic details of sexual assault, which some viewers may find distressing. Stephen John Port was born on February the 22nd, 1975, in Southend-on-Sea, Essex, the son of Albert and Joan Port. He has an older sister, Sharon. Though there is little information available on Port's early years, there are no indications that he had an unusual upbringing, or suffered any significant abuse, but his father disapproved of homosexuality, so the young Port was forced to keep his sexuality a secret. He was described by classmates as, in quotes, isolated and strange, meaning he was often bullied. One classmate described how he tended to sit alone and was visibly upset by the bullying. She went on to say that even though she was one of the very few people to treat him nicely, she was not really friends with him, as she too thought he was slightly odd. After leaving school at the age of 16, Port attended art college, but after this proved too expensive for his parents, he dropped out and trained as a chef for 2 years, after which he found work as a chef at the Stagecoach bus station in West Ham. He featured in a 2014 episode of Celebrity MasterChef filmed in the bus station, albeit in the background. Port was described as a strange man who, despite his 6'5" frame, was extremely childlike and sometimes played with children's toys. He lived with his parents until his early 30s, when, in 2006, he moved into 62 Cook Street in Barking, East London, where he lived for nearly 10 years until his arrest in 2014. Due to his social awkwardness and lack of social skills, Port struggled to fit in and rarely left his flat, but online he could portray himself as anything he wanted to be. He claimed, for example, to have been a graduate of Oxford University, served in the armed forces, and worked as a special needs teacher. As a balding man in his 30s, Port would wear a wig in photos on gay dating sites, both to hide his baldness and to appear more attractive to younger men. It was clear that Port was obsessed with sex, especially with younger men. After his arrest in 2014, police seized his computer and found that he was obsessed with, in quotes, date rape porn, in which men would sexually assault other men while they were unconscious. It seems likely that Port began to want to realise these sick fantasies. Port's earliest confirmed victim was from 2012, though it's likely that he had begun offending many years prior, when he met a 19-year-old university student on Grindr, an online dating website aimed at gay and bisexual men. The man visited Port's flat, described him as, in quotes, polite and friendly, and said he had no reason to worry. The young man was then given a glass of wine, noticed congealed powder at the bottom of the glass, and was immediately worried that he might have been drugged. He became dizzy and disoriented before losing consciousness. He would recall later that he could vaguely remember being dragged into Port's bedroom, undressed, and then raped. After regaining consciousness, he left the flat and sought medical advice because he felt he had been drugged. The man was not sure if what had happened was real or imagined. GHB is a white crystalline powder normally mixed with water to create a liquid solution. Often implicated in sex offences, it is normally colourless and odourless, making it effective in the commission of sex crimes. After the first victim noted congealed powder in his wine glass, which may not have been GHB, Port may have switched to GHB because it is much harder to detect when mixed in drinks. On New Year's Day 2013, a man called the police to say that he had been raped by Port and that Port had done this on numerous occasions beforehand. The man said that Port had plied him with drugs and alcohol to the point where he could not say no or fight back. Although Port was not arrested following this accusation, an entry was put on the police national computer database. The next attack came in June 2014, when a 20-year-old man, known only as B, met Port on a gay dating website. He visited Port's flat and described him as, in quote, a very nice guy. B was offered a drink and almost immediately lost consciousness. When he woke up, he was terrified and began screaming and shouting. Instead of calling an ambulance, Port supported B and walked him to Barking train station. B was vomiting profusely and barely able to stand. Port was noticed by 2 British Transport Police officers who were concerned about B's distressed and incoherent state, but Port reassured them that everything was fine and that B had simply taken GHB. It's unclear if B was actually raped, but this was clearly the intention. Port is also known to have repeatedly raped another man, known only as C. It's likely that there are other victims too, who have never come forward, likely for a range of reasons, including shame and the possibility that because they were under the influence of illegal drugs, they might not have been taken seriously even if they had informed police. Port's first confirmed murder victim was 23-year-old Anthony Walgate in 2014. Walgate, the son of Sarah Sack, was originally from Hull in East Yorkshire, but relocated to London to attend fashion college. He was struggling financially, and so turned to escorting to make money. On June 17, 2014, Walgate was contacted by Port, who arranged for his services in exchange for £800. It should be noted that Port had no savings, so he clearly had no intention of paying Walgate. Walgate met Port at Barking railway station, and then went with him to his flat. Exactly what happened next is known only to Port, but shortly after arriving, Walgate was given a fatal dose of GHB. It's also unclear whether Walgate was sexually assaulted at any point, as Port has never explained the events of the night of June 17, 2014. Regardless, Port stayed in the flat with Walgate's body, then went to work a late shift, not returning until 4 a.m. on the morning of June the 19th. After dressing Walgate's body, he took him outside and placed him on a wall next to the entrance to the building, before seizing Walgate's mobile phone so that their communications could not be seen. Port then put a small amount of GHB on Walgate's body and called the police. Shortly before 8 a.m, paramedics and police attended the scene, but it was clear that Walgate was already dead. Paramedics were suspicious because Walgate had been placed in a sitting position with crossed legs. They believed that if he had died of a seizure, he would not have been sitting upright. It was also apparent that Walgate had been dead for some time, died elsewhere, moved and then positioned by someone. Paramedics reported their concerns to the police, but nothing was done. A post-mortem found that Walgate had died of a drug overdose. His mother, Sarah Sack, was on holiday in Turkey when she received the news that her son had died. She returned to the UK and had only brief contact with the police. The phone call informing her that her son had died apparently lasted no more than a few minutes, and there was no investigation into his death. To compound Sack's grief, the family liaison officer assigned to her had written that Walgate had liked to drink and experiment with drugs, especially cocaine, which Sack vehemently denied. Sack refused to accept the police's conclusion that Walgate had died as a result of a drug overdose, and insisted that he had been murdered. Port came to the attention of Metropolitan Police as a result of this incident, because even though he had taken Walgate's phone, police were able to trace the number of the 999 call from June the 19th. Plus, Walgate had told a friend where he was going and who he was meeting. So on June the 26th, 2014, Port was arrested. Following his arrest, Port's story changed. Now, he claimed that he and Walgate had arranged to meet for sex in exchange for payment, but that when Walgate arrived in his flat, he took GHB and died in front of Port. Port said that due to panic, he took Walgate outside, propped him up, and then called the emergency services. Although police should have been suspicious of Port's altered version of events, Port was simply charged with perverting the course of justice, due to making a false report to the police, and was released on bail. Walgate had no history of using GHB, and the fact that he had already been dead for some time when he was found should have been suspicious to police. Furthermore, if police had investigated Port more thoroughly, they would have found the rape allegation against a man using drugs in 2012. Another major mistake was that although police seized Port's laptop, it took 10 months before they examined it. Had they examined the laptop and found Port's search history of date rape porn, they could have stopped all subsequent events. 5 weeks later, and while still on bail, Port committed his second murder. Gabriel Kovari was a 22-year-old Slovakian man who moved to England in June 2014 in search of a better life, with hopes to work as a translator for the NHS. In July 2014, he moved in with a man named John Pape, though they were not romantically involved. Despite this, the pair became close and Pape was upset when 6 weeks later, Kovari told him that he was moving out because a man had offered him a place to stay. The man was Stephen Port. Port became infatuated with Kovari almost as soon as he had moved in, with Port messaging a neighbour and telling him that he should meet his, in quotes, new Slovakian twink flatmate, and that he was, in quotes, taking good care of him. Kovari, however, was not attracted to Port and slept on the sofa. Sometime after 5 a.m. on August the 25th, 2014, Port administered a fatal dose of GHB in order to rape Kovari. Port then covered his tracks by creating a false identity online and informing Kovari's friends that Kovari had left the country. Port's sister rang later that day and would relate that he was, in quotes, distressed because there was a dead young man in his room. Port, the pathological liar that he appeared to be, would later tell the court that the man to whom he referred in the conversation with his sister was Anthony Walgate, who had died the month before, and that he was having a flashback. Kovari's body remained in the flat for the next 3 days, likely so that Port could decide his next move. In the early hours of August the 28th, 2014, Port carried Kovari's body to the churchyard of St. Margaret's Church, only 500 metres from his home. He placed the young man's body in a sitting position and put sunglasses on him so that anyone who saw Kovari from a distance would think that he was simply asleep. At 6 a.m. on the same morning, a woman named Barbara Denham was walking her dogs through the churchyard when she saw a young man sitting up against the wall. Thinking he was simply sleeping, she called out, but when there was no response, she approached him and touched him. Worried that he may have been dead, Denham called the police. Police found a bottle of GHB on Kovari's body. Despite the suspicious circumstances, police decided that he had simply overdosed on GHB and died where he had been found. No post-mortem was undertaken, and Kovari's body was returned to his family in Slovakia to be buried. John Pape was informed of Kovari's death and was in shock. He had no idea that Kovari had ever been a drug user, and was suspicious of the conclusions drawn by police. He pointed out how strange it was that 2 young men had died of the same drug within 500 metres of each other, and only 2 months apart. Despite these suspicious circumstances, police ignored his concerns. Sarah Sack was still mourning the loss of Anthony Walgate when she was informed of Gabriel Kovari's death. She too was convinced that the 2 deaths were linked, but again, police ignored her concerns. On September the 18th, 2014, Port committed his 3rd murder, that of Daniel Whitworth, a 23-year-old chef. Whitworth met Port at Barking railway station, and the two went to Port's flat. Sometime in the hours after Whitworth's arrival, he was administered a fatal dose of GHB, and then raped. While Whitworth's body was still in the flat, Port set about covering his tracks. He deleted his account on the dating website and then planted a fake suicide note on Whitworth's body before, sometime on the evening of September the 19th, 2014, transporting his body to the same churchyard where Gabriel Kovari had been placed the month before. The following morning, Barbara Denham, of all people, found Whitworth's body as she was out walking her dog. Stunned at having found herself in this situation again, she approached Whitworth's body and touched his stomach. After noticing that he was cold to the touch, she called police again to report that she had found the body of another young man in the same churchyard of St. Margaret's Church. Whitworth's body was found only 5 feet away from where Gabriel Kovari had been found, and, like Kovari, he was placed upright in a sitting position. Police attended the scene but felt that there was no way of saving Whitworth. He was found with a bottle of GHB on him. If police had investigated further, they would have found Port's DNA on Whitworth's jacket from where he had been redressed after his murder. Police also found an apparent suicide note, which read, "I'm sorry everyone, mostly to my family, but I can't go on anymore. I took the life of my friend Gabriel Klein. We was just having some fun at a mate's place and I got carried away and gave him another shot of G. I didn't notice, whilst we was having sex, he had stopped breathing. I tried to get him to start breathing again, but it was too late. It was an accident, but I blame myself for what happened. I didn't tell my family I went out. I know I would go to prison if I went to the police. I can't do this to my family. But at least this way I can be with Gabriel again. I hope he will forgive me. By the way, please do not blame the guy I was with last night. We only had sex, then left. He knows nothing of what I've done. I've taken what G I have left with sleeping pills, so that if these kill me, it's what I deserve. Feeling dizzy now as took 10 minutes ago, so I hope you understand my writing. I dropped my phone on the way here, so it should be in the grass somewhere." Again, the whole situation and the suicide note should have raised red flags, considering 3 young men had died within 500 metres of each other, 2 of them only 5 feet apart, and none were known to be regular users of GHB, all in the space of 2 months. If police had investigated properly, they would have found it odd how Whitworth was so distressed at killing his friend Gabriel Kovari that he called him Klein rather than Kovari. Plus, there was no evidence that Whitworth and Kovari had ever met or even knew of each other's existence. Finally, why would a man in the throes of grief take the time to mention a man with whom he had just had sex? If police had checked Kovari and Whitworth's phone records, they would have found that they were nowhere near each other on the night Kovari died. It was clear that Port was becoming more arrogant and thought that he could pin the blame of Kovari's death on Whitworth, despite the amateur nature of the suicide note. Police did not try to investigate further, otherwise they would have found evidence that a serial killer was operating in the area. Sarah Sack was now fighting for justice, not only for her son, but for the families of Gabriel Kovari and Daniel Whitworth. Port does not appear to have killed again for another year, but he attacked 3 men during this time. Male D was extremely vulnerable and met Port in his flat in January 2015, where his drink was spiked. D was then raped and Port filmed the attack. Port later showed him the video. There was a gap because Port went to court for perverting the course of justice related to the death of Anthony Walgate. On March the 23rd, 2015, Port was sentenced to 8 months in prison. The court had no idea that this man had already killed 3 men and attacked even more. Within a month of his release on June the 4th, 2015, Port had attacked again. E met Port on Grindr in July 2015. By this time, Port appears to have been experimenting with different drugs on men. While the two were in Port's flat, Port used a syringe to inject drugs into the anus of E. E felt a burning sensation and knew that something was wrong, so he left. F was already known to Port. They reconnected via Grindr in September 2015. F visited Port's flat but made it clear that he did not want to use drugs. Under the pretense of applying lubrication, Port once again injected drugs into F's anus with a syringe. F felt a burning sensation and began to feel lightheaded, but did not fall unconscious and was able to leave. In September 2015, nearly 1 year since his last murder, Port claimed yet another victim. Jack Taylor was a 25-year-old forklift driver who lived in Dagenham. On September the 12th, 2015, Taylor went out drinking with his friends and then went home. On returning home, he accessed Grindr and began speaking to Port. They agreed to meet at Barking railway station. CCTV footage shows the two walking to Port's flat. What happened in Port's flat will probably never be known for certain, but what is known is that Taylor was drugged and raped by Port and was dead by 7:30 a.m, around 4 hours after the two met. To cover his tracks, Port deleted the Grindr app from both his and Taylor's phones, so that their messages could not be found. Taylor's body remained in Port's flat for all of September the 13th, 2015. After it became dark, Port moved Taylor's body to the same graveyard where he had disposed of Gabriel Kovari and Daniel Whitworth. In fact, he placed Taylor's body against the wall only a few feet from where Kovari and Whitworth had been found. However, Taylor was placed on the opposite side of the wall. As he had done 3 times before, Port planted the bottle of GHB on Taylor's body, plus a syringe, and took his phone. Taylor was found by a different passerby this time, who alerted the police. Again, they appeared to take the evidence at face value, and determined that Taylor had taken a fatal overdose of GHB. After Taylor's family were informed of his death, they were adamant that something was wrong. They stated that Taylor had ambitions of becoming a police officer, so he was firmly against drugs. His family became so frustrated with the inaction by police that they undertook their own investigation, compiling their own handwritten evidence and sending it to the police. However, like Sarah Sack, the Taylor family were ignored, with the police saying that there was no reason to link Taylor's death to any of the previous 3 deaths in the last 16 months. Port appears to have been caught by chance. A detective reviewing the death of Anthony Walgate saw the footage of Port walking with Jack Taylor. On reviewing the footage closer, he realised that the tall man with Taylor was Stephen Port, whom he knew had been involved in the case of Anthony Walgate. At long last, police deduced that Port must have been involved in all 4 deaths. They also finally reviewed the contents of his laptop and discovered his obsession with date rape porn. After a new team of officers were assigned, Stephen Port was arrested on October the 15th, 2015, on suspicion of 4 counts of murder. He was interviewed the following day and gave very few truthful comments during the interview. I've included the link to the 11-minute police interview in the description. Port pleaded not guilty to all charges. He went on trial in the Old Bailey in October 2016. He continuously changed his stories, from saying that he did not know any of the victims, to that he did, to that all 4 men had been in his flat but that they had all taken fatal overdoses of GHB. Naturally, the jury did not believe him, and Port was found guilty of the murders of Anthony Walgate, Gabriel Kovari, Daniel Whitworth and Jack Taylor. He was also found guilty of drugging with the intention of raping, or actually raping, 7 men between 2012 and 2015. On November the 25th, 2016, Stephen Port was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the presiding judge, Mr. Justice Openshaw, recommending that he never be released. Port is one of only a handful of criminals in British criminal history condemned to end his life in prison, with no hope of release beyond the onset of terminal illness. Jamie Reynolds, whom I've already covered on this channel, is another prisoner serving a whole life order. To this day, Port continues to maintain his innocence, meaning he has never provided an explanation for his crimes. After Port's conviction, and partly in response to the families of the victims, the Metropolitan Police referred itself to the Independent Office of Police Conduct, or the IOPC. An investigation found that 9 of the 17 officers named in the report had demonstrated a standard which, in quotes, fell below the standard required. Although they were reprimanded for, in quotes, performance failings, they were allowed to remain in service. It was revealed by the Metropolitan Police in 2021 that 5 of the officers who had dealt with Port had since been promoted. The coroner's inquest concluded that the inaction in the investigation into the death of Anthony Walgate, in quotes, probably contributed to the deaths of the other 3 men. In June 2022, the IOPC announced that it would launch a fresh investigation into the police's handling of the Stephen Port case. Friends and relatives of the victims have accused Metropolitan Police of institutional homophobia, saying that the police likely would have handled the situation very differently if the 4 victims had been women. Although none of the 4 men can be brought back, one solace for the families is that Stephen Port will spend the remainder of his life in prison, and will never harm anyone again.